Daf Yomi, Tractate Chullin, page 26b. The last few words of the previous Amud were Tanu Rabanan, Hatemed ad shelo hechmitz. These are the last 6 words of 26a. The sages taught with regard to temed, that became ritually impure until it ferments. I think temed is like kind of it's like a watered down wine. It's like wine with grape skins or something like that. It's like not really wine, but it has some semblance. It's kind of like close to wine, but it's not really wine. That's what we were talking about. So now we're on the top of 26b. Mashiko b'mayim minishehech means Ein mashiko b'mayim omrove lo yishonel b'shetimdo b'mayim toirim b'nitmo avot b'mikoro. One brings the temed into contact with water of a ritual bath by immersing the vessel holding the temed in a ritual bath, thereby purifying the temed. Once it ferments, he does not bring it into contact with water, as that is effective only in purifying water and not purifying other liquids. Rava said the sages taught this only with regard to a case where one prepared temed with ritually pure water and it later became impure. But if the water was impure from the outset, the contact with the ritual bath would not purify. Also, Rav Givha mi Beikatil. Rav Givha mi Beikatil from Beikatil. He doesn't show up so often, but I do remember him in the past. Not recently, but in previous Masechtas. Also, Rav Givha mi Beikatil. Amorish ma'ita k'mei deravashi. Ma'ish netmei mikore de'amrina naidin ma'ya kichishach nitatai. ופרק כפים מלאים, ולא כסל כלהו השק למאיה. יחי תוירים. ולבסוף נתבונמי, Rav Givha from Beikatil went and stated this halacha before Rav Ashi and asked, what is different in the case of water that is impure from the outset, such that bringing the temed into contact with the ritual bath would not purify it, as we say? Since the water is heavy, it settles at the bottom of the vessel, and the fruit, the grape residue, floats above, and therefore contact with the water of the ritual bath would not be effective for the water of the temed. If so, the same would apply in the case of water that was ritually pure and ultimately became impure as temed also. Ela mi bavli, mi balbeli. Rather, the reason contact is effective in the case of ritually pure water that later became impure as temed is that the water and the residue are intermingled. Here tell, in the case of water that was impure from the outset, the water and the residue are intermingled, and contact with water of ritual bath would be effective, and contact with the water of a ritual bath would be effective. That's the end of that Talmud. And now we start a new Mishnah. Zog the Heilige Mishnah, kol makom sheish mecher and knas, kol makom sheish knas and mecher. These are really short Mishnahs. They're like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words Mishnahs. Any situation where there is a sale of one's daughter as a Hebrew maidservant. This is back in the day. Well, interesting to see historically when that happened. We talk about Mishpatim, So the Mishnah is saying any situation where there is a sale of one's daughter. We used to do that back then. Lighter. I saw a documentary that even in Pakistan, in some places, Afghanistan today, there are some very poor families who, unfortunately, lighter, they sell their daughter to an older dude who has some money, and you have daughters from mamish, very young, 11, 12, 14, 9, It happens. Any situation where there is a sale of one's daughter as a Hebrew maidservant, meaning when she is a minor, there is no fine of 50 selah paid to her father if she is beat or seduced, I guess is fine to say here on YouTube. If she is beat or seduced, as that fine is paid to her father only when she is a young woman. And any situation where there's a fine paid to the father, there is no sale. Alright. I'm not sure what this mission is doing in Chullin, but okay. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Marav, so divrei Rabbi Meir, אבל חכמים אמרו, יש קנס במקום מכר. תתניא כתניא בבס יום אחד, עד שטוב יש לי סיירויס. יש לו מכר ואין לו קנס, מי שטוב יש לי סיירויס. עד שתיפגע. יש לו קנס ואין לו מכר. דברי רבי מאיר. שהיה רבי מאיר אומר, כל מקום שיש מכר אין קנס, כל מקום שיש קנס אין מכר. Rabbi Yehuda says, the Rav says, this is the Talmud now, this is the Gemara is saying, Rabbi Yehuda says, the Rav says, this is the statement of Rabbi Meir, but the rabbis said, this is the possibility of payment of a fine in a situation where there is a sale, as it is taught in the Braita. A minor girl from the age of 1 day old until she reaches puberty and grows 2 hairs is subject to sale, but is not entitled to receive payment of a fine once she reaches puberty and grows 2 pubic hairs. From that point until she matures into a grown woman, she is entitled to receive payment of a fine, but is not subject to sale. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. As Rabbi Meir would state the principle, any situation where there is a sale, there is no fine. And in any situation where there is a fine, there is no sale. And the rabbis say a minor girl from the age of 3 years and 1 day until she matures into a grown woman is entitled to receive a payment of a fine. Knas in mecher lo, im av knas b'kom mecher. The Gemara asks, is that to say that yes, she is entitled to payment of a fine, but she is not subject to sale? Isn't her father permitted to sell her during most of that period? The Gemara answers, saying that the rabbi said she is also entitled to receive payment of a fine during that period in a situation where she is subject to sale. That's the end of that Talmud, and we start a new mission right now. Any situation where there is the right of refusal of a minor girl married by her mother or brothers, enabling her to opt out of the marriage, there is no chalitza, as a minor girl whose husband died without children cannot perform chalitza. And any situation where there is chalitza, once she has reached majority, there is no right of refusal. Gemara, the Talmud says, Rabbi Meir, Yesh miyum memkom chalitza, Netanya ad Moshe bas mimo enes, ad shitov yishtei sayrois. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ad shir be'ashochol lelovon. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda says that Ram says, this is the statement of Rabbi Meir, but the rabbis say there is the right of refusal in a situation where there is chalitza, as it is taught in the Braita. Until when may a girl refuse? She may do so as long as she is a minor, until she goes into puberty, which are signs of puberty, rendering her a young woman. They call it 2 hairs. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says she may refuse until the black hairs in that area appear to cover an area greater than the white skin of the area uncovered by hair. At that stage, she is already eligible to perform the rite of chalitza. That is the opinion of the rabbis. What if she's blondie? I mean, just say whatever the darker hair. Mishnah, zog the heilige Mishnah, zog the Mishnah, zog the Mishnah. Ay, 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 ay. Kol makom sheish tekiya in avdole. Kol makom sheish avdole in tekiya. Any situation where there is a shofar blast sounded on the eve of Shabbat, or a festival to stop the people from performing labor, and to demarcate between the sacred and the profane, there is no Havdalah recited at the conclusion of the Shabbat, or festival in prayer, and over a cup of wine. And any situation where there is Havdalah recited, there is no shofar blast sound. Yom Tov Shechal Yosef Ve'erev Shabbos Toikin Velo Mavdilin B'motzoi Shabbat Mavdilin Velo Tokin. How so? On a festival that occurs on Shabbat Eve, one sounds the shofar to stop the people from performing labor that is permitted on the festival and prohibited on Shabbat, and to demarcate between one sacred day and another. And one does not recite Havdalah, as that is recited only when the transition is from a sacred day to a profane day, or from a day of greater sanctity to a day of lesser sanctity. The sanctity of Shabbat is greater than the sanctity of the festival, and therefore Havdalah is not recited in this case, like this year. This year we had Shavuot on Friday. Here in Israel, we went into Shabbat, and we didn't say Havdalah. We just went into a higher level. No separation necessary. On a festival that occurs at the conclusion of Shabbat, one recites Havdalah, but one does not sound the shofar. Keitzad mavdilin. Hamavdil ben kodesh lekodesh. Rabbi Dosa Omer. Ben kodesh chamor lekodesh hakal. But we obviously don't go by that. How does one recite Havdalah in that case? What is the formula of that blessing? It concludes, one who distinguishes between sacred and sacred as opposed to the standard blessing at the conclusion of Shabbat. One who distinguishes between sacred and profane. Rabbi Dosa says that the formula is one who distinguishes between the greater sanctity and lesser sanctity. Okay? Didn't make it. Didn't make the cutting room floor. Got it. Alright? Let's go weiter. Zog the Gemara. Heichi tokei Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Tokei Maria betoch tekiya mitoch tekiya Rabbi Yasi Amar. Tokei Maria b'neshim achas atikei Rabbi Yasi b'utzad gishmaitei. The Gemara asks, how does one sound a tekiya on a festival that occurs on Shabbat Eve? When the difference between the sanctity of the preceding day and the sanctity of the coming day is not as pronounced as it is on a standard Shabbat Eve, Rabbi Yehuda said, one sounds a tekiya, meaning a long continuous shofar blast, and sounds a teruah, meaning a staccato series of shofar blasts from the midst of the tekiya. And Rav Asi said one does not sound a continuous blast, rather he sounds a tekiya and then sounds a teruah in one breath. Rav Asi instituted the practice in the city of Huzal in accordance with this halacha. Meisvei Yom Tov Shechal Yosef Shabbos Toikim Lo Merin. My love Lo Merin Klal Lo. Rabbi Yehuda mitaretz et tamei ורב אסי מתארץ את טמאי. רב יהודי מתארץ את טמאי לא מרין בפני עצמו, אלא מתואר תקיו, ורב אסי מתארץ את טמאי לא מרין בשתי נשימויס, אלא בנשימה אחת. The Gemara raises an objection to the statements of Rav Yehuda and Rav Asi from a Braita. On a festival that occurs on Shabbat Eve, one sounds a tekiyah, but does not sound a teruah. What? Is it not that one does not sound a teruah at all? The Gemara answers, no. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda explains the Braita according to his line of reasoning, and Rav Asi explains the Braita and according to his line of reasoning. Rabbi Yehuda explains the Braita according to his line of reasoning. One does not sound a distinct teruah, rather he sounds a teruah that emerges from the midst of the tekiah. And Rav Asi explains the Braita according to his line of reasoning. One does not sound the tekiah and the teruah in two breaths, rather he sounds them in one breath. U'b'motzoi Shabbat v'chulei hechi amar la amar Rabbi Yehuda v'chatimata v'chein amar Rabbi Nachman v'chatimata. The Mishnah states that on a festival that occurs at the conclusion of Shabbat, one recites Havdalah, and that the sages disagreed as to the formula of that blessing. The Gemara asks, where does one recite the formula in question? Rabbi Yehuda said he recites the formula at the conclusion of the blessing, but in the body of the blessing one recites the same formula. As in every conclusion of Shabbat, one who distinguishes between sacred and profane, between light and darkness, and likewise, Rav Nachman said, he recites the formula at the conclusion of the blessing. Rav Sheshes bereid Rav Yamal, af bepesichoso v'les halichosa kavase. Rav Sheshes and Rav Yidi said, one recites that formula even at the beginning, in the body of the blessing, instead of the formula one who distinguishes between sacred and profane. The Gemara comments, and the halacha is not in accordance with his opinion. Rabbi Dosa Omer ben Kodesh Chamor leKodesh Hakal v'le'esil Chazak Avate. The Mishnah teaches, Rabbi Dosa says that the formula is who distinguishes between greater sanctity and lesser sanctity. The Gemara comments, the halacha is not in accordance with his opinion. Omer Rabbi Zera, Yom Tov Shechal Yois B'emtza Shabbos. Omer Ramavzil Ben Kodesh Lechoil Ben Ol Lechoishech Ben Yisroel Agoyim Uben Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheish Zmei HaMaseh. My time, Seder Havdolis Hu Moine Hadran Aloch HaKol Shoichatin. Rabbi Zera said at the conclusion of a festival that occurs in the middle of the week, one recites to distinguish between sacred and profane, between light and dark, between Israel and the nations, and between the seventh day and the 6 days of labor, even though it is not Shabbat. What is the reason for that practice? He is enumerating a series of distinctions that the sages instituted, and not specifically the distinction unique to that particular day. Hadron Allah HaKol Shoichtin. May we return to you, Perak HaKol Shoichtin, and we start the next chapter, the next daf.